Only old-school Blade Runner fans can truly recall the gnarled amalgam of confusion, disgust, nausea, and outright revulsion that people's faces would twist into when you replied to the question, "What is your favorite movie?" with the words, Blade Runner. Sounds unthinkable today when it routinely tops AFI all-time great lists, but it's a testament to how 2007's encapsulatory Final Cut and WB's stunningly effective accompanying marketing campaign that the little futuristic film that could went from just this side of flop to sleeper success on the burgeoning home video market to cult favorite to critical favorite and finally to inarguably one of the most universally renowned sci-fi prophecies ever filmed. But for the purposes of the film Noirchives, it's also a keystone that strongly indicated the demise of the heretofore hibernating film noir genre had been greatly exaggerated. But die it did, in or around 1959 in fact. The culprits behind its demise are myriad, and we'll name names and discuss why a large-scale neo-noir revival has yet to occur in a special edition of the Noirchives at a later date. But contrary to its unofficial death date of January 1st, 1960, film noir occasionally resurfaced throughout the swingin' 60s in the likes of Point Blank or Shoot the Pianist, even sputtering along through the birth of neo-noir in the 70s, typified by underwhelming efforts such as the loathsome Long Goodbye, a postmodern piss-take with a deliberately neutered Marlowe, the filmmakers all but admitting it was intended to indict the genre and era it was adapted from with a generous slathering of Vietnam-era venality, but thankfully also touchstones like Chinatown, Farewell My Lovely, and The Big Sleep, even arguably Death Wish, Taxi Driver, and Dirty Harry, which while not necessarily noir, owe a substantial debt to it regardless, kept momentum for the movement high heading into the next decade, and that is when the neon hit the fan. Film noir collided with the 1980s, the decade that perhaps more than any other normalized and more importantly commercialized the precise manner of graphic violence, drug use, and sexual content that had been forcibly excised from the original film adaptations of noir novels. In the wrong hands, this could have degenerated into shallow prurience. Handled by sincere adherence, it can elevate otherwise mediocre material and sometimes even transcend the original noir epoch. Perhaps no single film typifies this phenomenon, the 1981's Body Heat. In essence, Double Indemnity with tits. If that sounds like a slight, it really isn't. It's one of the finest film noir of the modern era, and its appearance 1 year before the subject of today's episode is no coincidence.
I'm a married woman.
Meaning what?
Meaning I'm not looking for company.
You should have said I'm a happily married woman.
That's my business.
What?
How happy I am.
And how happy is that?
You're not too smart, are you? I like that in a man.
If the 70s were about deconstructing noir as an artifact of its time, the 80s paid unbridled, unironic homage to it, even when, as in the case of Blade Runner, it was being actively merged with another movie genre entirely, the equally disrespected, and until the breakout success of Star Wars long dormant, science fiction subgenre. Adapted from pulp prophet Philip K. Dick's frenetic mid-period masterpiece, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the heady existential sci-fi of the film's source text would appear to forestall any attempt to add a flavor of the scriptwriter's own. But upon reading The Long Tomorrow at Ridley Scott's behest, a comic by French demigod Mobius, who was offered an art design position on the film but declined, the decision to suffuse the sci-fi trappings with those of yesteryear's celluloid masterpieces seemed to make itself. And so that's precisely what Hampton Fancher did.
First of all, Deckard changed right away. I mean, I know the guy was a bureaucrat kind of in the book, which I liked. You know, glasses, briefcase, automaton kind of henpecked. I liked all that. By the second draft, I started to get noir-y with it.
I think it's interesting. It'll make a basis of a very good futuristic, urban film noir.
But even the original novel wasn't this existential. The tale of a moderately henpecked bureaucrat turned bounty hunter retiring androids to pay for a facsimile of a sheep in an era where we've wiped out most of the world's animal and plant life. The closest Deckard comes to a true crisis of conscience is during a surreal, truly Philip K. Dickian sequence at an alternate police station where Deckard is strapped into his very own Voight-Kampff machine and told that he himself is an android operating in an elaborate delusion. While it wasn't included in the film, Westwood's sensational Blade Runner PC game from 1997 lovingly recreated it for one of the game's more memorable sequences.
This was no precinct house I'd ever been in, and I thought I'd been in them all. The grunt to my right had the beefy harness bull look down pat, and his twitchy partner in the suit looked like he was just itching to chainsaw a couple of kneecaps. Other than that, Everything was hunky-dory.
Impersonating a police officer, huh? I guess the new Nexus models are a little more creative than the old ones.
I'm a Blade Runner. You don't believe me? Call Lieutenant Guza.
There ain't no Guza in the LPD.
Unless I've been walking around in a dream, there is.
That's what always bugs me. Yeah, the fact that these skin jobs always gotta live someone else's life.
No shit. Just make the call, damn it.
But Blade Runner's unique brand of humanistic neurosis has a far more familiar culprit, every man's constant companion, death. Director Ridley Scott was on the fast track to Star Wars in the early 80s, one of the cinema's true rising stars after the surprise success of Alien. With an eye for the Star Wars sequel, he signed on for a competing sci-fi epic, Dune. And then the unthinkable happened.
Something personal happened in my life. My elder brother died. And I, to coin a phrase, freaked out. Felt I had to go to work immediately.
To be faced with, you know, a brother dying of cancer, and then to die, it can often, I think what happened is maybe the lack of control over that kind of created a darkness.
What seems to be the problem?
Death.
Death. Well, I'm afraid that's a little out of my jurisdiction.
I want more life, fucker.
Reeling from his brother's untimely death, Ridley threw himself into his work, which unsurprisingly began to revolve around the fleeting nature of human existence and the soul-shattering question of what it is to live at all. This is the likely reason for the contravention of the androids of the original story and their motivations. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was the product of research Philip K. Dick performed while preparing to write The Man in the High Castle, researching Nazi Germany for the alternate future of his novel where they were the winners of the Second World War. He stumbled across a jaw-dropping journal entry from an officer at one of the death camps.
For me, the word android is a metaphor for people who are physiologically human but psychologically behaving in a non-human way. I got interested in this when I was doing research for Man in the High Castle, and I was studying the Nazi mentality, and I discovered that although these people were highly intelligent, they were definitely deficient in some manner in appropriate affect.
And he was reading the journals of an officer, an SS officer, who had worked in one of these camps. And one of the entries really caught his attention. And the entry was, "The screams of children keep me awake at night."
I became conscious of the possibility of a very highly intelligent human being who was emotionally so defective that the word human could not properly be applied to him. And I used this in my writing in terms of such terms as android and robot, but I'm really referring to an actually psychologically defective or malfunctioning or pathological human being.
Philip Dick's subsequent revelation that these could not possibly be humans because humans have empathy is the reason the only reliable method for determining a replicant's identity in both film and book is an empathy test.
Is this to be an empathy test? Capillary dilation of the so-called blush response, fluctuation of the pupil, involuntary dilation of the iris.
We call it void comp for short.
Now, there's a Nexus 6 over at the Tyrell Corporation. I want you to go put the machine on it.
And if the machine doesn't work?
The lack of empathy in the so-called reflex machines of the novel being so central a conceit, it's understandable that when he met with the movie makers mere weeks before his death, Philip K. Dick even argued with Ridley Scott about it personally.
To me, the replicants, or androids if you will, are deplorable. They are cold, they are selfish, they are heartless, they are completely self-centered, they have no empathy, they don't care about what happens to other creatures. And to me, this is essentially a less than human entity for that reason. Now, Ridley said that he regarded them as Superman who couldn't fly. He said they are smarter than humans, they are stronger than humans, and they have faster reflexes than humans. Well, then I said, well, gee, Ridley, I mean, holy smoke, golly levels, and that was about all I could think of to say, you know. That's rather a great divergence, you see. We've gone from somebody who is a simulation of the authentic human to someone who is literally superior to the authentic human. So we've now flipped it.
Yet perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of the cyber-noir masterpiece in question, both in book and filmic form, is that somehow, some way, this core Philip K. Dickian theme worms its way into the movie regardless. It simply materializes in a different aspect, this in spite of effectively the complete inversion of the replicant's role within the central conflict, no less. For the reflex machines of Dick's novel are still omnipresent and oppressive in the darksome dystopia of Blade Runner. The difference is, instead of being literal biomechanoids, it's the fascistic authority figures, the titular Blade Runners themselves, that have most divested themselves of the trappings of legitimate humanity. A theme only hinted at in the aforementioned fake police station sequence in Dick's story. In truth, the somber setting itself suggests humanity as a whole is complicit in the dehumanizing process. Vacant megastructures sprawl to the heavens, populated by a mere 1 or 2 people, even as streets in other sectors swell with a ceaseless crush of overpopulation and pollution. There's a sense in the cinematic adaptation, from the austerity of Taffy Lewis's dive bar to the sterile view screens even close family FaceTime each other with, that while the physical distance between the future denizens of Los Angeles circa 2019 is suffocating, the emotional distance is closer to a chasm. And look around you, from the honeycomb hotels of Osaka to the feces-strewn streets of modern-day LA itself. If that wasn't a reconnaissance photo from the future nearly 40 years distant, what is? It's easy in hindsight to say, well, the filmmakers simply looked at Asia in the 80s and reproduced it on screen, but truth is, Japan didn't even look like this until well into the late 1980s. Look at Ridley Scott's 1988 effort Black Rain for ready evidence that East Asia was still undergoing the cyber-neon renaissance we see today in the soaring spires of Taipei and the looming towers of Tokyo. Scoff at the quaint 2019 date all you like, the truth is, Blade Runner did predict the future. Their only mistake was the city.
Anybody that says Ridley's not a genius, just look out there, because there's more nationalities, more languages, and that's my opinion. It's more crowded than it was then.
I would say of all the big influential science fiction films, the ones that made a real serious stab at predicting the way things would be, this film has been the most accurate.
It showed Los Angeles many years from now being a cesspool. And 20 years ago when that was made, as opposed to 20 years today, you can see where Mr. Scott's vision is coming to pass.
But populating the future was another challenge entirely, with many considered for the title role. Eschewing his literary portrayal as a pussy-whipped pencil pusher, the film calls for an action star with a side of Sam Spade. While film noir great Robert Mitchum was initially considered for the role of Rick Deckard, the demanding action sequences disqualified him from all the bounteous blade running. In his absence, atypical casting choice Dustin Hoffman briefly rose to the top before Ridley heard the name Harrison Ford. Already a breakout star in some spaceship movie and its sequel, he was fresh off the set of another incoming classic franchise when he signed up for some replicant hunting.
I remember that I read a script, which I thought was interesting. The first version that I read of it, of the film, had some issues. I had some issues with. And I said to Ridley that I played a detective who does no detecting. How about we take some of this information that's in the voiceovers and put it into scenes?
He was wearing this hat, which he always wore, this Indiana hat. And Ridley was cross because he had intended to use that hat himself.
And he was still wearing a leather jacket and a kind of wide-brimmed khaki hat. And he was unshaven, of course he was Indiana Jones. I figured anything that Spielberg and Lucas were going to do was going to be a really good for this actor.
An irascible star, now in indefatigable ascent, over the course of filming he'd cross piss streams with everyone from production staff to co-stars, such that he hardly spoke 2 words to director Ridley Scott in the final days of filming. But he's one of the best for a reason, folks, and his on-set struggles never once affected the result on screen, particularly his sizzling interchanges with big-screen neophyte Sean Young as the Tyrell Corporation's icy surrogate, Rachel.
You mind if I smoke?
It won't affect the test. All right, I'm going to ask you a series of questions
Just relax and answer them as simply as you can. You're reading a magazine. You come across a full-page nude photo of a girl.
Is this testing whether I'm a replicant or a lesbian, Mr. Deckard?
Just answer the questions, please. Shakes? Me too. It's part of the business.
I'm not in the business. I am the business.
Young, for her part, never quite gets the credit she deserves for her turn in Blade Runner, with many at the time claiming Ridley had cast her solely for her look.
As a director, he's one of the most brilliant visualists I've ever met in my life, and he saw something in her visually that he wanted.
She looked beautiful, but I wasn't absolutely convinced about her as an actress.
I'd always go with the actor first, actor, capability first, look second, but you know, stars usually have that kind of combination of both.
She just came across so perfectly, so period and so right, and utterly beautiful. I mean, she could be an android. She may still be an android, for all I know.
And characterized today as a kooky almost was who sidelined her promising career prospects with quirky stunts like whipping Tim Burton on Batman Returns tryouts and occasional brushes with the law. In truth, her career cooled largely as a result of relocating outside Los Angeles in the 90s and objectively assessing what amounts to her first major role on Blade Runner, learning on the job opposite a marquee star with little patience for fledgling film stars, particularly on a set soaked with rain, billowing with stage smoke, and harried by endless production nightmares. She conducts herself with surprising grace, composure, and class, delivering an understated performance where just beneath the plasticine veneer of replicant cool, you sense there's a synthetic humanity struggling to emerge.
You think I'm a replicant, don't you? It's me with my mother.
Yeah? Remember the spider that lived in a bush outside your window? Watched her build a web all summer. Then one day there's a big egg in it.
The egg hatched,
And?
and 100 baby spiders came out. And they ate her.
Implants. Those aren't your memories. They're somebody else's. They're Tyrell's nieces.
I think he was nervous about First Timer. I think he probably did a big, oh no, what about this, what about her, what about her? And I said, well, I try that. Don't you think they're a bit old, a bit worldly? We want somebody who's less worldly. So we went through a bit of that. He wasn't thrilled.
Maybe Ridley was giving me more attention than he was giving Harrison because he was making the assumption that he didn't need that. Harry was never happy on that show. He never was.
There's a part of you that wants to be totally in sync with the director's ambition. And then there's a perverse part of you that says, it doesn't really matter. What matters is being there. And fuck it, it's just a movie. Let him worry about it.
While the actors have since downplayed the schism, numerous sources on set have recounted that so intense was the antipathy at times, they found the prospect of an apartment romance sequence almost insurmountable, with the costume department busying itself with futuristic hosiery and Ridley lighting the living hell out of it. What fizzled was the passion, until at last, exhausted with the experience, Harrison let loose and the scene took a psychosexual twist. And so, in lieu of a love scene, Blade Runner boasted what cast and crew came to call the hate scene.
Ridley, I think, was more or less talking Sean through her performance to a certain extent. And Sean and Harrison just did not click on any level.
It just didn't work, so we scrapped it. So they cleaned my legs up and then we did something else. But then Ridley told him to push me. And I remember being really surprised about that. And I also remember Harrison being, I think I was crying afterwards too. Like, I was sitting on that ledge where the blinds were behind me, and we did the scene, and he went over to the corner there, and he turned away from me, and he took his pants, and he mooned me, because he was trying to make me laugh, because I was going, woo-hoo-hoo. And I looked up and he was mooning me.
But it all paled next to the upstaging efforts of Dutch dynamo Rutger Hauer as the magnetic replicant antagonist Roy Batty. A microscopic part in the novel, it was understandably expanded for a film script in need of an opposing force, but it blew up when Hauer got his hands on it. Collaborating on staging, costumes, even at times writing his own dialogue, what emerged was one of the defining performances in science fiction history, a post-apocalyptic warrior poet, a man made for killing, who finds the meaning of life only when he stops taking it.
Fiery the angels fell. Deep thunder rolled around their shores, burning with the fires of oak.
You Nexus, huh? I design your eyes.
Sure. If only you could see what I've seen with your eyes.
Depicted as little more than a glorified gang leader in the novel, the film variant is almost a revolutionary, a kind of cyberpunk Christ figure. Aware of this symbolism, it's impossible to miss the meaning of several shots in the film, including an elevator outtake where he's pressed to the wall in an almost crucifix position, or the nail he pierces his own hand with to grant himself a momentary reprieve from the expiration of his 4-year lifespan.
6, 7, go to hell, go to heaven.
It proves a defining moment for Rutger Hauer, who stole every frame of film he's printed on and more than a few he wasn't. Joe Turkel as Eldon Tyrell is the embodiment of bureaucratic evil, peering inscrutably through Coke bottle lenses, unerringly evaluating every permutation on the chessboard of routine discourse. He embodies the irresponsibility and self-deception intrinsic to those who deign to declare themselves God. In a way, Jared Leto's languid echo of his character, despite a bottomless bag of awkward pauses and vocal tics in tow, was utterly incapable of replicating in the 2017 sequel.
If we gift them with the past, we create a cushion or pillow for their emotions, and consequently we can control them better.
Memories. You're talking about memories.
It's a testament to the casting department that they weren't alone. A cavalcade of character actor royalty shore up the proceedings with aplomb. William Sanderson is spectacular as the mousy introvert wunderkind of the Tyrell Corporation, J.F. Sebastian.
Methuselah syndrome.
What's that?
My glands, they grow old too fast.
Is that why you're still on Earth?
Yeah, I couldn't pass the medical. Anyway, I kind of like it here.
Daryl Hannah may never have been more magnetic than as Pris.
I think, Sebastian. Therefore I am.
Very good, Pris. Now show me why.
Brian James is the ideal dim-witted strongman.
My birthday's April 10, 2017. How long do I live? 4 years. More than you.
Joanna Cassidy's Zora, the ultimate Amazon with a heartbreaking character arc.
I'd like to check your dressing room, if I may.
For what?
For holes.
Holes?
Well, you'd be surprised what a guy would go through to get a glimpse of a beautiful body.
No, I wouldn't.
Even the unseen fifth replicant, Mary, whose role was cut from the film but would later be loosely reimagined as Dictora in the 1997 PC video game, seemed exceptional even in her screen tests.
And Mary was a fabulous part. It was a beautiful scene. She was dying, and she was extremely vulnerable. She had already completely broken down.
We looked at the budget and I said, I gotta cut things out. We can't even build this, we can't even schedule this. So she would be one of the replicants who would die.
6 replicants, 3 male, 3 female. 2 of them got fried running through an electrical field. We lost the others.
Edward James Olmos makes mountains out of a molehill performance as dystopian dandy Gaff.
He say you under arrest, Mr. Decker.
Got the wrong guy, pal.
Lopa, Negochma. Te vaya Blake. He say you Blade Runner.
Tell him I'm eating.
and M. Emmett Walsh as Captain Bryant never utters a moment of unmemorable dialogue.
Right, Deckard, you look almost as bad as that skin job you left on the sidewalk.
I'm going home.
Good learn from this guy. He's a goddamn one-man slaughterhouse, that's what he is.
Bryant is a classic film noir conceit, not only the hard-as-nails police chief archetype established by Donald Douglas in Murder My Sweet and Robert Middleton in The Big Combo, but an engine of plot convenience who always seems to know incrementally more than the bedraggled hero, pulling the protagonist inextricably forward, in fact, forcing him to in so many words.
It was quit when I come in here, Brian. I'm twice as quit now.
Stop right where you are. You know the score, pal? You're not cops, you're little people.
No choice, huh?
No choice, pal.
The ensemble sizzles through an admittedly muddled plot that suffered multiple reworks, many more clunky than the last, until literally long after the director had been fired from his own film. On paper, a formulaic affair of a down-and-out cyberpunk detective retiring facsimiles of humanity in an ever more darksome, decaying metropolis. The oppressive gloom extended well past the camera lens, however. To put it plainly, Blade Runner was anything but a happy set. A profusion of production wars and difficulties exacerbated by the complicated funding of the film, whereby the Ladd Company footed the lion's share with additional investment from Jerry Perenchio, Bud Yorkin, and others, averaging a migraine a minute for Ridley Scott, still only 2 films deep into what would ultimately be an illustrious career. His eye for detail remains utterly apart even today, but his perfection at that time was utterly unbending.
I found out before I left, in the beginning of pre-production, that he'd gone to the Bradbury building. I said, really, that's ridiculous. Every TV show in the world has used that building. And that's a bad idea. Don't use that building. And he said, not the way I'll use it. And I thought, what arrogance. And I was so wrong, because he knew what he talked about, that he could make that a spectacular moment.
Must get lonely here, Chan.
Not really. I make friends. They're toys. My friends are toys. I make them. It's a hobby. I'm a genetic designer. Do you know what that is?
No.
Resulting in everything from scheduling woes and eventually to going 10% over budget.
I could feel the pressure almost all the time that I was on the set. Possibly one of the worst pressure conditions I have ever been in.
I think he was indulgent. I think I saw 13 or 14 or 15 takes at times that you couldn't tell the difference between one and the other. And many times I asked him, why did he do it? And he said, well, in the back, do you see the shadow? I wanted a bigger shadow. And I often thought, if my mother is looking at that shadow, we don't have a picture.
The famous police station sequence filmed at Union Station in Los Angeles required the construction of a full police office set with all the costs associated with such, which is exactly what they ultimately did. Cutting a construction deal with the city of LA, what was once the set of Bryant's office in Blade Runner, still stands today as one of the terminal kiosks at Union Station.
We made a deal with them to cut back on the location fee if they would, take the set, which they did.
Their labors finally finished, the pressure cooker nevertheless continued to broil.
We had Union Station in Los Angeles, and they spent the whole day lighting it. And then we finally we had, a half hour, we had to do the dialogue. All this other was just preliminary, and then we gotta get it.
The scorching cinematography of unsung Uber legend Jordan Cronenweth positively paints its ink wash aesthetic across the celluloid canvas, rivaling and I'd argue even surpassing both classic and modern practitioners of the film noir form, made all the more impressive by the fact that Jordan had not only to contend with a demanding director with an able eye for detail of his own, but that he was, during the making of the film, suffering from a mystery ailment that would ultimately leave the beleaguered genius confined to a wheelchair by the final weeks of filming. Soon thereafter, he'd learned he'd been suffering from Parkinson's disease for the duration.
Embarrassingly, it wasn't a doctor that discovered it. They were at a cocktail party, 6 months after Blade Runner, and someone inadvertently said, "How long has your husband had Parkinson's disease?" And she was like, "No, of course, he's got MS." She said, "Oh no, he's got Parkinson's."
His work was beautiful. It was different. On many occasions, it was all different from each one to the next. And I've never seen a movie that he made that wasn't an extraordinarily looking movie.
But at least on set, no one had a more contentious relationship with Scott than the star of the film. Harrison Ford's relationship with Blade Runner is a complicated one. As he expressed then and now, the success of Star Wars was both boon and albatross, an establishing influence that threatened to typecast him in perpetuity if he wasn't careful. Blade Runner was his first major effort to subvert the anti-hero gallant stereotype of Han Solo and Indiana Jones, and perhaps for that reason, he made more directorial demands than usual, requesting instruction and attempting to collaborate his way into the creative process. When he encountered a stone wall where Ridley Scott's perfectionism stood, it nearly came to blows.
It's fair to say that Harrison and I were nearly always quarreling, partly to do with the fact that I think I was so used to getting my own way.
So he'd often be sitting up in the sky on a crane doing the last book on the table position when Harrison was sort of seething and not being told what to do.
Working with Steven Spielberg and working with George Lucas, there was a commonality among all three of them, which was all three of them very much pulled Harrison into the creative process of building that character.
He doesn't talk about it, which is a great pity because I still believe it's one of his best films.
But Ridley never lacked for fisticuffs on set, with deadlines looming, having already signed away home video rights to financiers as he crossed the 10% over budget threshold and was at last fired from the film, along with producer Michael Dealey, yet preposterously allowed to continue cutting the film.
On paper, they didn't require us to anymore. And the reason for that is they were permitted to do that because we were 10% over budget.
I wasn't too concerned about whether somebody was happy or not happy. I was now hanging out the window saying, wait a minute, this has become a nightmare.
There were a lot of people on Blade Runner, looking around, watching, because it was taking a long time to shoot it. And there were always money people coming and saying, you can't, and Ridley would not give in. Basically, they couldn't break him.
On the film, I became a screamer. I got really angry, and which is not good because screaming doesn't get you anywhere, really.
I tried to articulate to Ridley later on that he's taking money that should be my children's, so that I'm now digging into my personal money.
It's just a piece of absolute rubbish and ill-mannered rubbish at that. They were going to finish the picture without the director.
I think we went through that $20 million, and all of a sudden somebody's tapping on your shoulder and saying, so then you start paying a little closer attention when you have to start writing the checks yourself, so to speak.
I think Bud secretly wanted to direct it himself, and if he had, it'd be obviously a very different movie. There was conversations like that led nowhere because we stood by Ridley and said, he's got to finish the movie. That's what we bought.
A gesture of unbridled spite that goes a long way to explaining why, despite the latter-day demand for a definitive final cut of Blade Runner, it took 25-plus years to actually get one. So rushed was filming at times, it actually impacted the final result more visually than one might expect. What might appear an artistic choice to have the sky go slightly blue behind Rutger Hauer as he spares Deckard's life and in so doing discovers the value of his own, was in fact a result of the sun coming out on what was literally the last day of filming.
He went with a dove in his hand, because he came to me and said, I thought simpler piece, is this okay? And I'm going, yeah, go on, really. The light's getting blue.
With no time to labor the issue and a long night shoot at their back, Rutger intervened with a last-minute deathbed soliloquy he'd written on lunch break in his trailer, and so was born the infamous Tears in Rain speech.
There was a real page of opera talk that, is bad in any script. I don't care how you look at it. And this was high-tech speak that had very little bearing on anything, that the movie had shown you before. So I just put a knife in it.
We are 2 hours from dawn, because we're nearly in the summer months, I think, yeah. And it's already gone blue. So I go to the trailer and say to him, okay, you've got to get out there now, we're ready. And he said, look, I've got these words. He said, I've just been noodling with them over dinner.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion.
Rutger read those lines and then kept on going, and he had a bunch of other stuff, which included the tears in the rain and everything.
There's only so much poetry you can get rid of, you know, and these images are so strong. And then, you know, I came up with the line, all those moments will be lost. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain.
And then he looked at me very sheepishly like I've been a naughty boy, you know, like, you know, he's an actor and he'd written these lines.
If I had $1 for every line of that speech a synthwave artist has stolen for a song title, I could fund a third film. It goes without saying Roy Batty steals the screen from Harrison Ford, but upon reflection, it's not entirely Ford's fault.
His role didn't seem to fit him, or he couldn't make it fit. I know that was going on, and I don't know why, but if he would have been stronger, I would have not been so shiny.
Saddled with a puerile voiceover in the theatrical cut, and in the director's and final cut, a somewhat insipid suggestion that he may be a replicant himself, which, while cleverly implemented, takes a sledgehammer to the same philosophical subtleties that made the original novel and theatrical cuts so appealing.
Now, the theme of the book is that Rick Deckard is dehumanized in his job of tracking down the replicants and killing them. In other words, he winds up essentially like they are. And Ridley said that he regarded that as an intellectual idea, and he was not interested in making an esoteric film.
The story really only works if Deckard is human. The theme of the movie being the journey of a man rediscovering his humanity. And he goes through all this moral confusion, and he comes out at the end of it a real human being again. And if Deckard's a replicant, it's like, all that's gone. So I completely reject that.
The replicants were all such great characters, and Harrison Ford's character is such a dumb character. He gets a gun put to his head, and then he fucks a dishwasher, and then he falls in love with her. It doesn't make any sense.
Make no mistake, the method with which Ridley Scott disseminates this suggestion is masterful. The out-of-focus replicant glare in Deckard's eyes in an otherwise perfectly innocuous apartment scene, which Harrison Ford claims was an accident resulting from walking into Rachel's light, by the way. A slightly less subtle unicorn reverie first featured in the 1992 director's cut, which paired with Gaff's origami unicorn at the film's conclusion, comes as close to spelling out the situation as you're ever likely to get, not to mention Rachel's own words.
You know that Voight comp test of yours? Did you ever take that test yourself?
Myself, I reject this suggestion purely for purposes of quality control. Look, if Deckard is a man as advertised, then it's a film about a human who becomes dehumanized through the act of hunting down and killing false humans, who falls in love with one of those false humans, and upon being spared by one of them, ultimately reclaims his humanity. If he's a replicant, then we're witnessing a confused construct wasting other confused constructs before running away from the only characters with an actual arc. No growth, no development, a straight line dramatically, and indeed everyone from other cast members to all three writers, including the original author, to Harrison Ford himself, tends to fall on my particular side of the argument.
When I saw that red shit in his eyes, I said, give me a break, no, please don't. And Ridley's tricky. I think probably that was Ridley's, it's gotta be Ridley's decision.
I think Deckard is a real guy, and I think he's in pain for it, and he knows he's gonna live a long time and, like, suffer.
Whenever I thought that I was possibly being positioned as a replicant, I would seek out Ridley and argue against it.
No, I never thought he was a replicant. No, that's never in my mind.
Fortunately, Ridley Scott, while obviously sympathetic to one side, is clever enough to know the question is more intriguing than an ultimately idiotic answer.
You weren't answering a question, you were asking a question. What is it that makes us different?
And my interpretation had nothing to do, that shows that Deckard's a replicant. I don't think anything should show that Deckard's a replicant. If you think that, you're already wrong. You know? I mean, it's just the question mark is what's interesting.
The answer is stupid.
In the words of Harrison Ford, quote, "I think ambiguity is endlessly productive. I have no arguments with ambiguity. It's the finality I have an argument with," unquote. But Deckard's humanity wasn't the only major dispute Philip K. Dick would have with the film or its makers. While ostensibly neoteric, the very fusion of sci-fi and film noir that brings us all here today was also a marriage that the author, ironically himself a product of pulp, curiously abhorred.
It was just one terrible screenplay, and that was my opinion. Now, I can't pretend that I'm an expert on screenplays. I don't see that many screenplays, but it was intrinsically disappointing. It was terribly corny, and it was extremely maladroit throughout. The execution of the script was bad, because what he had done was he had relied on the old, overworked, really cliche-ridden figure of Philip Marlowe and Sam Spade, unified, and they were already doing movie parodies of that figure in the London trench coat, and then the voiceover, it was a dirty town, it was a dirty job, someone had to do the job, and that was the way the script went. It literally had voiceover.
Yet some of these objections appear to be directed not so much on the concept itself, but on the way Hampton Fancher specifically chose to adapt it.
He was very intelligent. He was very self-centered, kind of egomaniacal. He would do odd things. When he was talking to you, you got the idea that he was like theatricalizing him. Anyway, Hampton.
I saw 2 drafts by Hampton, and one draft where Peoples had come in, and neither draft by Hampton was any good.
I said to him, in fact, I said, "You act like I'm some guy with sunglasses and a cigar who's come up in a convertible trying to take advantage of you. I'm not. I'm trying to get you to make this movie." And the last time I saw him, I was leaving. And I'm usually not this forward about these things, but I said, "You know what? I'm not coming back because I don't think you like me."
This is a crucial detail because by all accounts, Hampton Fancher's screenplay, at that time entitled Dangerous Days, was well undercooked. Its lofty intellectual aspirations utterly bisected by amateurish implementation, clunky dialogue, and a plot that went precisely nowhere. Hell, the initial incarnation of the screenplay was set almost entirely in a single apartment building. It was then Ridley Scott, sensing the script was still unfilmable, who enlisted the writing talents of David Peoples. At that time an editor with only a documentary writing credit to his name, he would ultimately win an Oscar for The Unforgiven. Though initially relegated to writing the city-speak slang used throughout the film, his hard science fiction sensibility and direct approach to plot proved the ideal antidote for Fancher's florid prose and camisole-thin narrative.
He said, "Yes, your things are very elegant, but this is what we need to do to make the movie. Now we're making a movie, Hampton."
And I thought actually bringing in something like Peoples would maybe create some fresh air in the corridors.
I said, "What do you mean?" I got rat fucked. I quit. I'm out. I'm gone. Then fuck you guys. And I called Ridley and said, "I'm out of here," and I was insane. I wanted my name off the picture,
Peoples power injected a much-needed emphasis on comprehensible plot and sci-fi into the film, which by now had paid to license the title of an unrelated William Burroughs novel so it could undergo its final christening as Blade Runner. Peoples' approach is perhaps perfectly exemplified by Tyrell and Roy's back-and-forth genetic design duel in the Archon's apartment, where Roy, incapable of accepting his impending demise, attempts to intellectualize his fate.
Then a repressive protein that blocks the operating cells.
Wouldn't obstruct replication, but it does give rise to an error in replication so that the newly formed DNA strand carries the mutation and you've got a virus again. You were made as well as we could make you.
But not to last.
The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long, and you have burned so very, very brightly, Roy.
On the face of it, little more than Blade Runner babble, but in retrospect, not nearly as nonsensical as it may seem, as the majority of the interchange is actually genetically and scientifically sound. Some of Peoples' contributions couldn't quite make the cut due to budgetary reasons, however, including a more dramatic off-world introduction to Rutger Hauer's character amid a pile of rubbish and replicant corpses.
Actually, it wasn't a bad scene. It was in a off-world junkyard, androids being plowed under.
It was like I just wrote an off-world scene of all these bodies heaped up, and then gradually somebody emerges from the heap, and it's Roy Batty.
This intro was ultimately scrapped, but fortunately Peoples was able to resurrect it for the film he'd write as a spiritual successor in 1997, Soldier. In fact, it was only after David Peoples' high sci-fi additions that the script not only took on much needed and additional coherence, but Philip K. Dick himself at last conceded the undeniable excellence we were soon to witness.
Once I read the David W. Peoples version, I literally bulk erased everything from the two previous screenplays. I literally did not want to remember them. It then became very, very vital for me to do an about face after I read the later version where David W. Peoples had come in, because his is so much better that virtually everything that I had been saying was no longer applicable. In fact, it was diametrically null.
The audio you've just heard dates to mere days before Philip Dick's untimely demise, where in a single David Peoples rewrite, the querulous scribe went from deeply cynical in the extreme.
I mean, my opinion was doubly negative in that I did not approve of what it tried to do, and I did not think it accomplished what it tried to do.
To outwardly effusive and now actively anticipating the eventual release, one Phil would sadly fail to see himself, though thankfully he did have occasion to view an early highlight reel of the film's visual effects, and his reaction was legendary.
Katie Haber gave me a call and said, put together the best of the best in a reel, and it was left to me to go in with a few of my key people, and he and his friend to go down and sit in the screening room, and he said very little, and I said, roll it. Philip Dick turned around and looked right through the back of my head, and he said, how is this possible? How did this happen? It's like you guys hardwired my brain. That's what I saw when I was writing that story. I don't understand this. How can this happen?
Knuckle-dragging cinema snobs that dismiss Blade Runner, or increasingly only the original Blade Runner, often do so under the auspices that it's more about the setting than the story, a pretty film with precious little to actually impart. This statement is absurdity squared. Blade Runner is a story of post-collapse confusion. Though when stated in the script, the text of the novel specifies that it takes place at some indeterminate point after World War Terminus, a conflagration so all-encompassing 2/3 of the animal life on planet Earth have ceased to exist, while humanity takes to the stars, preferring the opulence of off-world colonies to the decay and dysphoria of earthbound existence. A world where an artificial android is more secure in its sense of what comprises a human than the organic beings that birthed them. The dizzying spires of cyberpunk Los Angeles collapsing together in a bramble of brick and steel, with buildings jutting out at odd angles, no apparent rhyme or reason to the skyline's layout. Hell, the prop department even found space for a kitchen sink and the Millennium Falcon far in the distance, are a visual reflection of this confusion. From the moment Deckard's spinner sets down on Police HQ, he whirls, spins, as the name suggests, in tandem with the cinematography. Effects supervisor Douglas Trumbull and cameraman Jordan Cronenweth ingeniously encircling the site that will serve as the centrifuge for Deckard's impending existential dilemma. The more the snare enshrouds its hapless victim, the tighter the camera gets. So tight, in fact, that when the LAPD's errand boy, an impeccably groomed feet figure under the ambiguous sobriquet of Gaff, enlists him back into the Blade Runner fold, he's pushed from the shot completely, with only the ex-Blade Runner's bemused expression, some off-screen dialogue, and the bottom of a well-trimmed Van Dyke mustache to indicate he's even having an interchange at all. All of it punctuated with one of the finest film scores to ever grace the medium. Vangelis's resume was well established by the time he took on the Blade Runner gig, but his seamless fusion of film noir saxophone with breathless 80s synthscapes inspires awe to this day, one of the precious few elements of the film's production that worked right from the beginning.
One of the great experiences that would follow for me will be scoring at Marble Arch with Vangelis. He doesn't just lay on score and say, well, that works. He goes through everything. He thinks himself into the film. He would sit and watch every frame and say, watch the actor here, watch this blink, I want to start here on the blink, and be that close.
He had huge voice of the theaters, speakers on top of the buildings. And so when he would start the scene, he played the sound score. Vangelis had already given him some temp stuff, and he'd blast it into the street so that you were working inside of a full ongoing environment. I remember, when the first notes hit me, I was like, wow.
Contrary to its reputation among cinematic neophytes of being a highlight reel of wide-angle effect shots, something the sequel haplessly mimicked to lesser effect, in truth, much of the movie is shot in tight, entrapping close-ups, seeming to zoom closer and closer in until the final confrontation, when we're literally so tight we can clearly discern the texture of the rain-sopped drywall and brand of Deckard's futuristic Mannlicher revolver. When Roy Batty utters his final euphony, the dove ascends to the heavens, and Deckard dawns on the realization that the nature of his biological existence is less important than what he chooses to do with it. The film pulls back from the claustrophobic close-ups, and we're treated to our first full-figure, wide-angle shot of the previously enigmatic Gaff, the mystery of his motivations slowly becoming clearly delineated in the deluge.
It's too bad she won't live. But then again, who does?
Film noir, remember, is not mere atramentus lighting, omnipresent fog, and trench coats. It's a crime film shot like a horror film, the camera an active participant in the protagonist's inner conflict and mounting terror. The more the audience's surrogate is ensnared, the more the cinematography smothers the viewer with suffocating close-ups, moments of emotional liberation being marked by wide-lens, relaxing establishing shots. The rooftop sequence alternates these approaches on an almost shot-by-shot basis, with Ridley reusing his tight hand-to-foreground face-to-background shot from Alien before falling back to a distance when he emerges apparently unscathed on the rooftop filled with windmills. And what happens once he's confronted by Batty on the very same rooftop? Tight, tense, quick-cut close-ups frenetically relaying Deckard's panic. Curiously, the final and director's cut of the film, which conclude after the final apartment sequence where Deckard discovers Gaff is spared his bioengineered inamorata, is again shot relatively tight, an implicit suggestion that their flight from the authorities has only just begun as he silently, stoically backs into the uncertainty of the elevator door fading to black, while the theatrical cut, with its much-maligned happy ending, pulls well back into bucolic surroundings as they flee the oppressive hellscape that bays at their heels. The lone reprieve from the stifling cyberpunk. In short, to damn this film with feigned praise by saying the setting's pretty but the story is crap is to admit to the lowest form of filmic ignorance, because in Blade Runner, the visual setting is the story. In fact, I've long argued one of the reasons Blade Runner's sequel suffered from a terminal case of pacing deficiency is because it was written by Hampton Fancher without David Peoples to bounce his poetic concepts with puerile execution off of and pound it into something more lucid. Pair that with a European director more interested in art house lighting and lens flare, and the feckless final result comes better into focus. It also explains how the sequel shed even the faintest trappings of noir.
Here I am coming in with this kind of weird thing, if not a little confounding, because it's not straightforward, right? It's very Marlowe-esque and very dark.
J.P. Talat once wrote of Marlowe and the Chandler protagonist, quote, "Thanks to Chandler's first-person narration, all that we see in the Marlowe novels is what the detective himself sees. His experiences and his thoughts are ours. This outer directedness ultimately proves just as important as Marlowe's moral stance, in so much as style is equivalent of theme, since it equally defines our relationship to the world he inhabits. Through Marlowe, we become different from, and in many ways stronger than, that world. We perceive its truth, understand its ways, and avoid its pitfalls as no one else in the novels can. What this singular experience produces, in effect, is a new vantage on the relation of the psyche and the surface, as how we perceive becomes our one sure proof against what waits on those mean streets."
I've been out peeking under old Sunday sections for a barber named Dominic, whose wife wanted him back. I forget why. The only reason I took the job was because my bank account was trying to crawl under a duck. And I never found him.
She didn't know then what was happening to her. She didn't know then that what she heard was the door closing on her own cage. She hadn't been faithful to him when he was alive, but she was going to be faithful to him now that he was dead.
It had begun to rain outside, and I watched it get dark and didn't even turn on the light. That didn't help me either. I was all twisted up inside, and I was still holding on to that red-hot poker. And right then it came over me that I hadn't walked out on anything at all. That the hook was too strong.
With early Blade Runner test audiences settling on the consensus that the film's story was equal parts plotting and impenetrable, the obvious choice to include a Raymond Chandler-esque voiceover suggested itself. But if the filmmakers had considered it for more than a microsecond, they might have realized what a profound error it was. The voiceover in classic noir isn't for exposition, it's street poetry, to inculcate the audience not with expository minutiae, but the protagonist's streetwise dissertation on the perils of urban existence, and most certainly not to narrate events already explicitly delineated on screen.
I didn't know whether Leon gave Holden a legit address, but it was the only lead I had, so I checked it out.
I was there when Harrison did it, and it was just horrendous. It was like a sort of what Ridley calls Irving the Explainer, you know, my name is Deckard and I am an android catcher, and, you know, and Harrison hated it so much that he did it really, really badly, hoping they wouldn't use it, and they did.
Maybe it was a scale. A fish scale. Real or artificial. You need an expert to tell. This is bizarre. God damn, this is bizarre.
Why?
Well, I don't know.
It's common knowledge that Harrison Ford famously detested the voiceover, and with good reason. It's a good idea in theory, but utterly abhorrent in practice. What many don't know is that removing the voiceover narration was a condition of Ford accepting the role to begin with, which brings Harrison's distaste for the addition better into focus in retrospect. Worse still, Hampton Fancher having quit the project and Peoples long departed, it fell to hack contract writers, namely Newhart Show alumni Roland Kibbe, himself utterly divorced from the creative process, to pen the explicatory pablum.
And he had a little pipe, I believe, and he was hammering away at a little portable typewriter. I thought, this must be a writer. So I leaned and I said, "Hi, I'm Harrison. How you doing?" And I got this.
He had nothing to fear from Bryant, but a lot to fear from me if he'd killed her. I don't like that. Let's start again.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Didn't you say that bothered you?
No, but I
You said that was getting in your way.
No, sir, not.
I'm sorry, I heard you wrong. Go ahead then.
So desultory was the final result, it gave rise to the apocryphal rumor that Ford had deliberately dogged the performance on the sixth and final recording session to ensure it wasn't used in the film. Asked where he believed the rumor had come from, he responded in 2007, quote, "I don't know and I don't care. I've worn that narration thing for years, you know. It's correct to say I was very unhappy with the final result. I was unhappy with the editorial choices that they had made regarding the different versions I had recorded, because there were variations between those versions, better takes of voiceover I had read. There was no way I was purposefully sabotaging my work by adding this clumsy narration, but I will tell you that I thought it was so bad there was no fucking chance in hell they were going to use it, particularly that last version," unquote. But for all its idiocy, it isn't all bad. Its low points fall with a thunderous thud for a fact, but its high points adding the occasional flash of color to flesh out the world of Blade Runner.
Come on, don't be an asshole, Deckard. I've got 4 skin jobs walking the streets.
Skin jobs. That's what Bryant called replicants. In history books, he's the kind of cop used to call black men niggers.
Flawed or not, many, myself included, love the idea of the voiceover, if not always the execution, evidenced by the Criterion Laserdisc of Blade Runner, which for a long time was the only version which included said voiceover, going for retro gaming prices on eBay, at least until the final cut came out and included all of the above, driving said SAP prices back down to earth.
I love that voiceover. I want it. I keep replaying my Criterion Laserdisc to hear that voice. You know, I think that there was an effect that worked for me.
Really, with the additional detail included in the first-person narration, not to mention the alternate ending, in truth, it's the theatrical cut of Blade Runner that feels a bit more like a director's cut than the version of the film that actually bears that erroneous appellation. Contrary to its namesake, the theatrical cut clocks in over a minute longer than the director's cut. And speaking of such, one of the most notable divergent points betwixt all extant versions of Blade Runner is its conclusion. With focus groups and test audiences then as now all the rage in Hollywood, criticism of the more ambiguous ending where the elevator door slides shut on Deckard's apartment and the audience, as the throbbing synthesizer of Vangelis's main title theme bellows throughout the theater, made the multiple financiers of Blade Runner, particularly Bud Yorkin and Jerry Perenchio, apoplectic. Ridley, often cast as a difficult directorial diva, but more often than not amenable to studio concerns, suggested a quick fix.
I'm always there to try and say, right, what can we do? Shit, it's not really working. I think it was Jerry's team said, you know, it's that dark ending, we need a happy ending.
It was tacky. The whole idea of the end was tacky, in my opinion. It always was right when they shut that door.
While reasonable minds may differ on the voiceover, there can be no two ways about this one. Whichever version you prefer, the theatrical cut's tacked-on happy ending is insipid fatuity in filmic form, yet rather hilariously was also made official canon by the oh-so-artistic CGI-soaked sequel. To the Blade Runner faithful, it's an affront, upending the introspective, oracular 2 hours that preceded it entirely in favor of a cloying conclusion that would give Walt Disney diabetes.
Gaff had been there and let her live. 4 years, he figured. He was wrong. Tyrell had told me Rachel was special. No termination date.
I liked everything except the last scene, the driving off into the sunset. Didn't buy it, didn't believe it. Looked like it came from another movie to me.
Worst of all, this verdant conclusion, compiled of aerial outtakes from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, inexplicably clashed with the city it's set in. Initially envisioned as a sprawling supercity of San Angeles, as the name suggests, an urban Goliath that spans the California coast from San Francisco to San Diego, even momentarily relocating to New York City for a spell, it was eventually decided to scale back to the City of Angels, albeit with the East Coast's incumbent rain and fog in tow. Hiring industrial designer Sid Mead onto the film as a visual futurist to draft working concepts of cars, apartments, and even furniture was a flourish of unqualified brilliance. Sid Mead was no movie maker. He was designing actual items for use in the future. He'd studied demographic data extensively because those were his employer's future customers.
The premise was that, in my design sort of mind, that with these enormous structures going up 2,000, 3,000 feet, decent people never went below the 60th floor. So you had these big pylons and supporting the architecture, and the street then became like a basement.
Sid is this wonderful combination of artist and practitioner and sociologist. He can talk for hours about the logic of urban planning, urban decay, and sociological decay and disorder.
But it was Sid Mead's unique creative process that almost accidentally created what is today defined as the Blade Runner look.
And I had never done an isolated object on a white sheet of paper, because that's not the way things exist in the real world. They have surroundings.
Sid designed this whole world, but he designed not just what would be the matte paintings, but conceived of what the streets would look like and what the neon would look like and what the lighting would look like. Sid wasn't really the production designer per se, but he was the stylist.
The destroyed look of the future, the fact that he photographed a future that was already old, and I heard him say this when we were talking about the script and how we saw the movie. I thought it was so fascinating. The future is old. It's not new.
This era of retrofitted familiar futurism can be found in more than mere art design. If the eagle-eyed film Noirchives squints exceptionally hard, in fact, they might even recognize the bustling city streets of Los Angeles in 2019, derisively dubbed Ridleyville by cast and crew, as a rain-harried variant of the very same Warner Brothers backlot where The Big Sleep was filmed.
Over here is the Leon Hotel.
Just up there?
Yep. Over there is Mr. Chu's shop.
Oh, this is Chu's Ice House.
This is the Ice House.
Okay. And then straight ahead of us, right down there, that's the night scene. What happens
There's the night scene where the midgets come through and the masses of people coming through at night.
The set carried with it no shortage of difficulties, not least of which the rolling hills of Southern California looming in the distance. Suddenly, the decision to film at night in the rain made perfect sense. Almost as a happy byproduct, it came to define the future noir feel of Blade Runner.
That was one of the main reasons why we decided to shoot at night, because we could eliminate having to mat out the green mountains and the trees.
Because if you look down the end of the street, you can just see glorious hills.
Exactly.
It wouldn't have looked good. It looked pretty bad, and we would have had to spend more money. So by shooting at night, you save money, and it looks better. And it's always raining, it looks better. So those three elements are always my armory: night, wet, smoke.
But the science fiction itself was no mere window dressing either. Even earliest drafts of the script addressing environmentalism, social collapse, and artificial humanity in equal measure, albeit inexpertly in the overall. As brazenly as it departs from the source text, in an odd kind of way, Blade Runner functions as a kind of companion piece to the original book and vice versa, the themes it chooses to explore diverging and occasionally intersecting with the core consciousness of the Philip K. Dick novel. Androids describes a refuse society, a city surrounded by sprawling hills of techno-trash called Kipple, comprised largely of the scarred war machinery of a bygone thermonuclear conflict. While the environmental concern Hampton Fancher was so taken by is indeed present, it's a result of protracted military conflict, meaning Blade Runner's far-flung future was ravaged not by some looming enviro-catastrophe, as some cinema critics have contemporaneously alleged, but by protracted bombardment and descent into total war. And at least in the original film, this may well still be the case, with the PC game that spun off from it going so far as to expressly acknowledge the conflict and even set the climactic sequence in and amongst said Kipple.
Maybe I can help Clovis find some peace before he dies, then we'll see. Where is he?
He's been struggling out in the Kipple, trying to get the moon bus fixed. If you could help repair it, maybe we could all leave together.
How far out are they?
A few miles north of the city.
There's bound to be tons of radioactive waste between here and there.
The shell-shock nature of the society itself speaks to this. Here is a populace encased in Kipple, walling themselves off from others. The merest glance at Bryant's office, teeming with trinkets and walled in by stacks of paperwork, or Deckard's detritus-laden bachelor pad with its stifling clutter and claustrophobic ceilings, or even Tyrell's or JF's capacious quarters, each more massive than the last, but nevertheless littered with baubles to establish the image of a population utterly severing itself from one another, first emotionally and finally physically, each individual retreating inward, a sovereign nuclear nation unto himself, each one utterly isolationist. If you can't see the shadow of the true 2019 in that, my condolences on your glaucoma diagnosis. It's eminently noir either way, and you see it echoed in the Sternwood greenhouse sequence of The Big Sleep, where a dying man, insulated from the travails of his progeny, cocoons himself in greenery and derives enjoyment from watching others indulge the vices which advanced age now forbids him, a conceit Captain Bryant steals, likely in direct homage to the Raymond Chandler original.
How do you like your brandy, sir? In a glass. I used to like mine with champagne. Champagne cold as Valley Forge and with about 3 ponies of brandy under it. Oh, come, man. Pour a decent one. I like to see people drink. You may smoke, too. I can still enjoy the smell of it. Nice state of affairs when a man has to indulge his vices by proxy.
Come on, gal. Drink some for me, pal.
If the future noir eponym so often ascribed to Blade Runner seems a touch trite, I'd ask to find a better one. Science fiction doesn't quite do it. The story's simply too urban, too crime-ridden, and existential to be strictly speaking sci-fi. You have an entrapped character, multiple femme fatales, endless night, torrential rain, cinematography mirroring the mental turmoil of its players. Like all noir, it's a crime film cum psychodrama lit like a horror picture. There's no other name for it than noir. It just so happens to be noir with a twist of sci-fi, resisting easy categorization, not to mention competing in a crowded 1982 summer slate alongside John Carpenter's The Thing and E.T. At release, Blade Runner was a film forsaken by sci-fi fans in favor of lighter fare, like the aforementioned Spielberg film and Star Wars, and simultaneously derided by film noirophiles for being B-film bad, an ironic declaration given most classic film noir literally began its life on the B-roll. But make no mistake, this is film noir, not because trench coats, booze, and booming saxophone, but because the core urban isolation, the sense that sauntering down that one last lonely street could be your last, pervades the proceedings every bit as profoundly as in any film noir of the 40s and 50s. Decades of craven imitation and countless tributes have elevated the would-be bomb to perma-classic status for one simple reason: it's crafted with a care not seen since.
I look at Blade Runner as the last analog
science fiction movie made, because we didn't have all the advantages that people have now. And I'm glad we didn't, because there's nothing artificial about it. There's no computer-generated images in the film.
A fearless testament to the power of the film noir genre, Hollywood has long since forestalled in favor of fluffier fare. But we pulp fans prefer the hard stuff, straight up, and we're not alone. American film will never again have the entirety of its soul so long as it continues to ignore one of the stylistic pillars of its provenance. For the Film Noirchives, I'm Razör. Have a better one.
Nothing is worse than having an itch you can never scratch.
I agree.